Welcome to Mr. Kellen's Stories. Here we bring you powerful, emotional and heartwarming stories that will stay with you long after the credits roll. From deep love and intense drama to life-changing moments, every tale is designed to captivate your heart and mind. In our latest story, after saving the CEO, she vanished. 25 years later, they meet again. Follow the extraordinary journey of two souls who are brought together by fate, love, and the power of second chances. With twists, suspense, and an unforgettable reunion, this is one story you won't want to miss. So grab your popcorn, subscribe, and join us on this unforgettable ride. Don't forget to share, like, and comment, because your story matters to us too. The city pulsed with life, even as storm clouds rolled in. Neon lights flickered against the wet pavement, reflecting like shattered glass across the streets of New York. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the rooftops, hammering the sidewalks, and turning the roads into slick, treacherous pathways. Inside a sleek, black Mercedes, James Harrington gripped the steering wheel tightly. His jaw was set, his sharp blue eyes flickering with satisfaction. Tonight had been a victory. He had just closed $1 million deal, the kind that would cement his position at the top of the business world. At just 25, he was already a force to be reckoned with. The world knew his name. They respected him. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the darkened cityscape. The wipers of his car struggled against the relentless downpour, but James hardly noticed. His mind was elsewhere, basking in the glow of success. He loosened his tie with one hand, exhaling deeply. Everything was going according to plan. But fate had other ideas. The moment was brief, just a fraction of a second. A sharp turn, a puddle too deep, tires losing grip. Before he could react, the car skidded violently across the road, spinning out of control. The street lamp loomed ahead, and a sickening crash shattered the silence. Metal crunched, glass shattered, and pain exploded in James's head as he was thrown forward. His vision blurred, blood trickled down his forehead, his breathing came in short, ragged gasps. He could hear the muffled sound of rain hammering against the crushed hood of his car. The scent of gasoline and burnt rubber filled the air. His body felt too heavy, his limbs refusing to move. And then, footsteps. At first he thought he was imagining it. But no, someone was running toward him, splashing through the rain. The car door jerked open, and a soft, trembling voice cut through the chaos. "Sir, can you hear me? Stay with me." James struggled to open his eyes. A silhouette hovered above him. A woman, her face blurred by the rain. But her voice was full of urgency, warmth, desperation. She pressed her small, trembling hands against his forehead, trying to stop the bleeding. The contact sent a strange sensation through him, not just the sting of pain, but something deeper, something comforting. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her breath hitching. "Just stay awake." James tried to speak, but his throat felt dry, his words lost in the storm. She fumbled for her phone with shaking fingers. 911, please hurry," she cried. "He's hurt. There's blood everywhere. I don't know how bad, but he's not moving much." A crackle of thunder rumbled above, shaking the ground beneath them. James could barely focus, but he forced himself to look at her, the woman saving his life. Her hair was soaked, curls plastered against her face. Her eyes, dark, deep, full of emotion, stared down at him with concern. Rain streaked down her cheeks like tears. She was young, maybe his age, dressed in a thin hoodie and jeans that clung to her skin from the downpour. Who was she? Why was she here? Why did she care? Sirens. In the distance, the wailing cry of an approaching ambulance cut through the night. Help was coming. James tried to lift his hand, to touch hers, to say something, to ask for her name. But before he could, she pulled back. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost sad. Red and blue lights flooded the street. Tires screeched as the ambulance came to a halt. Paramedics rushed forward, barking orders, pulling James from the wreckage. James tried to fight the haze in his mind, tried to see her one last time, but she was already stepping back, disappearing into the rain. The paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher. Voices swirled around him, calling out his name, checking his vitals. The world tilted, darkness threatened to swallow him whole. With the last ounce of strength he had, he turned his head, searching for her. But she was gone, just like that, like a phantom in the night. And as the ambulance doors shut, sealing him inside, one thought echoed in his mind before he blacked out completely. Who was she? The weeks that followed the accident were a blur of sterile hospital rooms, beeping machines, and nurses who came and went. James Harrington, once driven by ambition and focused solely on success, now found himself lying in a hospital bed, his body healing, but his mind restlessly searching for something he couldn't quite grasp. The doctors had told him he was lucky to be alive after such a violent crash. But to James, there was no luck involved. Someone had saved him. A woman, a stranger, a force that had appeared in the storm, offering him comfort, hope, and the kind of care he had never known. But when he had come to in the ambulance, she was gone, vanished into the rain like a dream fading at dawn. His heart ached with questions. Who was she? Why didn't she stay? Every time he closed his eyes, her face appeared, the way she held him, her trembling hands pressing against his forehead, the worry in her eyes, the kindness in her voice. It wasn't just gratitude he felt. It was something deeper, something he couldn't explain. A connection, maybe, a bond formed in the most unlikely of circumstances. The search began. James was a man of action. He wasn't used to waiting, especially not for answers. He had the resources, the money, the influence, the connections to find her. And so he started, pouring his focus into solving this one mystery that haunted him day and night. His first step was checking the CCTV footage. He had hoped there might be some clue, perhaps a glimpse of her face as she rushed to his side, anything that could lead him to her. Hours passed, but the footage was a blur. The storm had washed out much of the video quality, and the cameras had failed to capture the crucial moments. Nothing, just the twisted wreckage of his car, the flash of headlights, the blur of rain. He tried a different route, placing ads in the newspapers. He used every word he could think of to describe the mysterious woman. If you saved a man on specific street during a storm on specific date, please come forward. He even included his contact information. Days went by. Weeks. Nothing. The newspapers ran his ad in a few editions, but all he got were meaningless responses, fake tips, hoaxes, people claiming they had been in the area, but none of them were the right person. He even hired private investigators, a handful of them, the best in the business. They were experienced, methodical, and resourceful. They combed through every possibility, every lead, every tiny scrap of evidence. They traced the weather patterns, the traffic cams. They even talked to witnesses from nearby businesses, but they found nothing either. The woman had simply disappeared. James was frustrated, angry, and most of all heartbroken. He couldn't understand it. She had saved his life, and yet she had vanished without a trace. Was it because of him, because of the life he led? Maybe she had been scared of getting involved, scared of what his world might mean for her. He was a CEO, a businessman who was constantly in the spotlight. What could someone like her, someone so real and grounded, want with someone like him? The world moved on. It always did. But James didn't. Each morning, as the sun rose over the skyline, he felt a gnawing emptiness inside him. A sense of unfinished business. He had everything he'd ever dreamed of: success, wealth, power. But this one thing haunted him. This one unanswered question gnawed at his soul. He didn't need to see her again, not right away. But he needed to know who she was. He needed to thank her, to tell her that her kindness had meant more than words could ever express. She had given him more than a second chance at life. She had given him hope, and that was something he hadn't known he needed until it was given to him. He couldn't let it go. So James did what he always did. He threw himself into his work. But even as he led meetings and made deals, his mind was constantly elsewhere. He would catch himself staring out the window, his thoughts drifting to that stormy night, to the woman who had saved him. At night, when he was alone, the silence of his apartment was deafening. He would replay the events over and over in his head. Her voice, her touch, the way she had held him together in that moment of pain and darkness. Some nights he almost convinced himself it had been a dream. Maybe his mind had conjured her in his delirium, a figment of his imagination during his recovery. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. She had been real. She had been everything real in that moment of chaos. And as weeks passed, James's obsession with finding her only grew. He was a man who didn't let things slip through his fingers. He would find her, one way or another. The world had changed in the 25 years since James Harrington's life was irrevocably altered on that stormy night. The once young and ambitious CEO of Harrington Industries was now a powerful billionaire. At 50, James had reached the pinnacle of success. He had wealth beyond measure. A sprawling penthouse with breathtaking views, a fleet of luxury cars, and a business empire that spanned the globe. He had everything anyone could dream of. And yet every day something seemed to be missing. The bustling noise of his life, the constant meetings, the endless calls, the sprawling contracts, often drowned out the emptiness that lingered beneath it all. No matter how many accolades he received or how much wealth he accumulated, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had never truly found peace. There was something from his past that still haunted him, something he couldn't forget. It was the woman who had saved him, her, the mysterious savior from that fateful night. He hadn't seen her since the moment he had lost consciousness in the back of the ambulance. And despite the years that had passed, despite his best efforts to move on, a part of him always wondered, where was she? What happened to her? James tried to push the thoughts away, but they would creep up in the quiet moments, the moments when he was alone. It was a bright autumn afternoon, the kind of day when the sun shone down through the trees, casting a warm glow over the city. The leaves had started to turn gold and amber, swirling gently in the breeze. James had taken a rare break from his hectic schedule. He wanted to get away from the noise, the constant buzz of his office, the relentless demands of his world. He had heard about a newly opened cafe downtown, a small, quaint place that was gaining popularity. It was nothing like the luxury restaurants he often frequented, but something about it intrigued him. A sense of simplicity, of authenticity. So for the first time in years, he decided to step out of his usual comfort zone and try something different. The cafe was nestled between tall buildings, tucked in a quieter part of the city. It had a rustic charm, with wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and soft jazz music playing in the background. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air as James stepped inside. The warmth of the place wrapped around him like a cocoon, a stark contrast to the cold steel of his high-rise office buildings. He ordered his usual, black coffee, no sugar, and took a seat by the window. He stared out at the street, watching the people walk by, their faces blurred by the reflection of the cafe's soft lighting. As he sipped his drink, the sound of the doorbell jingled, signaling the arrival of more customers. He barely glanced up, too caught up in his thoughts. But then, something caught his eye. A woman. She was moving gracefully between tables, a tray in her hands, her presence so familiar, yet so impossible. She had deep brown eyes, the kind of eyes that could look into your soul and make you feel seen. Her smile was warm, genuine, like a ray of sunshine breaking through a cloudy sky. James's heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be, but it was. For a moment, everything around him seemed to fade away. The clinking of coffee cups, the chatter of customers, even the music that filled the room. All he could see, all he could feel, was her. The woman he had spent years searching for, the woman who had saved him. His breath caught in his throat. Could it really be her? She was no longer the young woman who had saved him all those years ago. Time had passed and life had changed them both. She looked different now, older, yes, but still just as beautiful, still just as striking. Her face had softened with the years, but her eyes still held the same warmth, the same depth. James stood up, unable to contain the overwhelming rush of emotions that flooded through him. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed his chair back. She looked up from her tray, her eyes meeting his. And in that instant, everything stopped. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a spark that seemed to say, "I remember you." Her lips parted, and for a brief moment James thought she might say something. But then she looked away quickly, as if unsure, as if she didn't want to acknowledge the possibility that it was him. He couldn't just let her slip away again, not after all these years. With quick, purposeful strides he moved toward her. "Maya," he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Is it really you?" The moment the word left his lips, he saw her stiffen, her face momentarily clouded with confusion and hesitation. But then her eyes softened. Recognition dawned in her gaze. She took a step back, as if uncertain, and her voice trembled slightly. "James?" It was him. It was truly him, the man she had saved all those years ago, the man who had haunted her thoughts for years. She had never forgotten that night, that connection, the way she had held him in her arms as the world crashed down around them. But she hadn't expected to see him again, certainly not like this, not in a cafe in the middle of the city, not with 25 years between them. She took a deep breath and forced a smile, though her hands trembled slightly. I can't believe it." James's heart raced as he stepped closer, not wanting to let her retreat again. "I've been looking for you for so long. You saved my life, Maya, and I've never been able to forget you." Maya's expression faltered for just a second before she shook her head, as if trying to shake away the years of separation, the uncertainty, and the overwhelming emotions that were building inside her. I never thought I'd see you again," she whispered, her voice soft. James's hand hovered in the air, his fingers aching with the desire to touch her, to hold her, but he didn't want to make her uncomfortable. Instead, he took a step back, giving her space, allowing her to process the shock of this sudden reunion. Her deep brown eyes looked at him, filled with a mixture of emotions, shock, relief, joy, and something deeper that neither of them could put into words. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Time had slipped away, the world had faded into the background, and all that remained was the two of them. After all these years, here they were, together again. James's heart was racing. The world around him had ceased to exist the moment their eyes met. For the first time in 25 years, everything he had carried with him, the questions, the longing, the need to know, seemed to finally be within his grasp. She was here, the woman who had saved his life, the one who had disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. He was standing right in front of her, and yet something felt wrong. He stepped forward, each movement deliberate, his voice barely above a whisper. "Excuse me," he said softly, trying to keep the tremor in his voice under control. His eyes searched hers, desperate for recognition, for an answer. She looked up, her deep brown eyes locking with his. For a moment time seemed to freeze. The busy cafe, the bustling noise, the clinking of coffee cups. It all vanished, leaving only the two of them. "Do I know you?" Her voice was calm, but there was a flicker of unease in her gaze, something that James couldn't quite place. She seemed cautious, as if afraid of the memories that his presence might awaken. James's heart thundered in his chest, and he swallowed hard. He hadn't expected this moment to be easy, but he hadn't prepared for this feeling of distance between them, this barrier. He took a step closer, his voice gentle yet firm. 25 years ago, he paused, trying to steady himself. 25 years. How could he possibly explain everything in a few sentences? How could he make her see how much he had thought about her, how deeply her kindness had impacted him? "A car accident," he continued, his words feeling too small for the weight they carried. "You saved me. You—" Her face went pale, as though a wave of cold had washed over her. Her eyes widened with something close to panic, and James felt his stomach tighten. He didn't know if it was fear or shock, but he saw it in her expression, a shift that made her retreat inward, shut down. She quickly looked away, her body tensing. James's breath hitched as he watched her turn her back on him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice suddenly cold, distant. The words hung in the air, heavy with something James couldn't understand. Denial? Fear? She took a step back, retreating toward the counter. I have work to do." Her tone was sharp now, almost dismissive. She avoided his gaze, her hand gripping the edge of the counter like a lifeline. James stood frozen, the sting of her rejection hitting him harder than he had expected. Was this the same woman, the one who had held him in her arms when he had been on the edge of death, the one who had whispered words of comfort, whose touch had felt like a lifeline? How could she forget him so easily? But as his mind raced with confusion and hurt, he saw the briefest flicker in her eyes, something that told him this wasn't just denial. This wasn't about forgetting. There was something more. The woman turned away without another word, moving swiftly to the back of the cafe, disappearing behind a door that swung shut with a soft, almost final click. James's heart felt like it had been wrenched from his chest. He couldn't believe what had just happened. Was that it? Had she really just walked away from him, after everything? But something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Why was she lying? What was she hiding? He stared at the door she had disappeared through, his mind a whirlwind of questions and emotions. What had happened all those years ago? Why had she saved him, only to disappear, and now deny it completely? James knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not when he had come so far. There was a hidden truth here, and he would uncover it no matter what it took. His gaze lingered on the door, and with a steely resolve, he walked slowly to the counter. He had to speak to her again. He had to understand why she was hiding, why she was afraid to face him. But as he approached, the cafe felt like a different place now. The once warm and inviting space now felt cold and unfamiliar. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken heaviness that seemed to settle over the room. James's every step felt weighted with the truth he was about to uncover. His fingers clenched into fists. What had happened to her? Why had she shut him out? As he reached the counter, the barista gave him a polite smile. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked, unaware of the storm brewing inside James. James shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "No, thank you." He turned his attention back to the door where Maya had disappeared. He couldn't leave. Not without answers. James's mind was consumed by the unanswered questions. The brief interaction with Maya had left him unsettled, more than he had anticipated. Why had she denied everything? She couldn't have forgotten him. He was certain of that. The connection they had shared, the life-or-death moment when she had saved him, couldn't be erased so easily. And yet she had turned away from him, as if he were a stranger. He wasn't convinced by her cold dismissal. Something wasn't adding up. James had built his empire on one thing above all else: determination. He wasn't the kind of man to back down in the face of a challenge. He had faced tough decisions, cutthroat competition, and personal loss, but the one thing he couldn't tolerate was being ignored, especially when the answers he sought seemed just within his reach. The next day, he returned to the cafe, hoping that perhaps time would have softened her, that maybe she would be willing to talk now. He needed answers. The encounter from yesterday had only raised more questions, but when he walked through the door, he saw her immediately. She was at the counter, serving customers with the same grace as before, but the moment her eyes met his, she stiffened. Her lips parted in a silent gasp, and for a fleeting second, James saw something: fear, regret, flicker across her face. Before he could say anything, Maya quickly turned her back to him, disappearing into the kitchen without a word. James felt a mix of frustration and confusion stir inside him. What was she so afraid of? Why couldn't she just face him and tell him the truth? He stood there for a moment, watching her retreat, his thoughts swirling in a haze of unanswered questions. The anger he felt wasn't just at her, it was at the situation itself. Why was she hiding? What was so important that she couldn't even acknowledge him? Someone she had saved, someone who owed her his life. As he walked out of the cafe, James made a decision. He couldn't do this alone. He needed more information, something concrete, something that would tell him who Maya really was and why she was running from him. James had connections. He had people who could dig into anything, anyone, and uncover the truth. He didn't trust easily, but when it came to finding answers, he was relentless. He hired an investigator that same day. The investigator, a quiet and efficient woman named Grace, was quick to work. Within a matter of days, James had a file on Maya Thompson. Her name was Maya Thompson, a name that had once meant nothing to him, but now felt like the key to a puzzle he had to solve. She was a single mother, raising a 20-year-old son named Caleb. James couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy as he read the details. Maya's life seemed far removed from his own. While he had everything, money, power, a life of luxury, Maya had built her life from the ground up. She worked at the cafe to make ends meet, and from the looks of it, she was doing everything she could to provide for her son. But as James dug deeper, he began to notice something that didn't sit right. There were gaps in her story, missing years. She had no significant ties to the people around her, no family connections. It was as though she had deliberately isolated herself, as if she had wanted to disappear from the world. But why? James leaned back in his chair, staring at the file. Why would someone who had once saved his life, someone who had made a choice to help him in his darkest moment, hide from him now? There was one detail that stood out, a previous address that didn't quite match her current one. It was a small, modest home in a quiet part of the city, but it had been sold years ago, and she had moved to a new place without any explanation. No mention of her son's father, no details about any family or friends. Just Maya, Caleb, and a string of missing years. James's gut told him that there was more to this story. He couldn't just sit back and wait. Maya was hiding something, but what? And why was she so determined to keep him at a distance? The woman who had once saved his life, whose kindness had kept him alive against all odds, was now running from him. But James wasn't one to give up easily. He had spent his entire life fighting for what he wanted, and he wasn't about to stop now. If there was one thing he knew, it was that people's secrets never stay hidden forever. He just had to be patient and persistent. He had to uncover the truth. There had to be a reason why Maya was so afraid, and James was determined to find it. The night air was cool as James stood across the street from the cafe, watching Maya as she walked out into the dim glow of the streetlights. She looked the same as always, focused, composed, her expression a mask of calm that didn't quite match the turmoil James could see in her eyes. But tonight, he wasn't going to let her slip away. He couldn't. Not again. With every passing day, his thoughts about her grew more intense. The puzzle of her past, the mystery surrounding her sudden disappearance 25 years ago, it haunted him. And now, after all this time, he was ready to confront her, to get the truth. She had avoided him once, twice, maybe more, but this time he wasn't going to let her hide anymore. He crossed the street quickly, his footsteps silent against the wet pavement. As he approached her, Maya turned and looked at him. Her expression faltered for the briefest moment, but she quickly regained her composure. James felt his heart skip a beat. "Maya," he called softly, his voice filled with urgency but also an unmistakable gentleness. "Please, let me talk to you." She stopped walking, but there was a wariness in her eyes. "James, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have anything to say to you. Please, just go home." But James wasn't going anywhere, not without answers. "Maya, you can't keep avoiding me. You saved my life, and now all I'm asking for is the truth. Please, tell me what's going on. Why are you running from me?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment Maya's face twisted in what could only be described as a battle of emotions. He saw her eyes glisten with something close to regret, or maybe fear that had kept her silent for all these years. Finally, Maya took a step back, her breath shaky as she let out a long sigh. The weight of what she was about to say seemed to hang between them, pulling at the very air around them. "James," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "it's not what you think. It's not that I don't want to talk to you. I just can't, because I knew who you were. I knew who you were the moment I saved you." She paused, struggling to keep her composure. "And I knew people like me don't belong in your world." James's heart dropped. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had prepared himself for many things, but hearing that someone like her didn't belong in his world, was not what he had expected. "What do you mean, Maya? What are you saying?" Maya looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with something deep, something he couldn't quite place. She looked away, her hands trembling at her sides, as if she was battling herself, trying to decide whether or not to open up. Her mouth tightened into a thin line, and James could see the pain in her expression. "After I saved you," she began, her voice wavering, "I went to the hospital to check on you. I wanted to make sure you were okay. But when I arrived, I overheard something that changed everything." Her gaze dropped to the ground, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the memory was too much to bear. James's pulse quickened. "What did you hear?" Maya's eyes were distant, as if seeing something from the past. She took a shaky breath, gathering her strength. "I overheard your father, James. He was talking to one of his colleagues in the hallway. I shouldn't have been listening, but I couldn't help it. I heard him say, he said that he would never allow a poor black girl to be around his son. He called me a distraction and said people like me had no place in his world." Her voice cracked at the last word, and the pain in her eyes was almost too much for James to bear. "He said it right there while I was standing just a few feet away." James stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. Her words felt like a slap across his face. He couldn't believe it. His father, the man who had shaped everything in his life, the man who had taught him the importance of control, of power, had said that? Had spoken of her like she was nothing more than dirt beneath his feet? His stomach churned with disgust. Maya's voice trembled as she continued. "I didn't know what to do. I felt so small, so invisible. I wanted to walk in and confront him, to say something, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he was right. People like me don't belong in your world, James. I didn't want to be a part of that. I didn't want you to look at me like I was someone who didn't belong." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her shoulders shook slightly as she held them back. I didn't want to see the disappointment in your eyes when your father made it clear that people like me weren't welcome. So I left. I walked away, and I never looked back. James's heart shattered as he listened to her words. He had been so focused on his own life, on his own world, that he had never stopped to think about the consequences of his family's expectations. He had never stopped to think about how his father's influence might have torn someone like Maya apart, leaving her with nothing but pain and fear. He clenched his fists, his anger rising like a storm inside him. How could his father, his own father, say something so cruel, so demeaning? The thought of what Maya must have felt in that moment made his blood boil. She was just trying to help. She had saved him. She had given him a chance at life. And his father had tried to tear her down, to make her feel like she didn't matter. "Maya," he whispered, his voice full of raw emotion. He took a step toward her, his eyes filled with sincerity. "You do belong in my world. You always have. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what my father said. He was wrong, Maya. He was wrong about you. And I won't let him tear us apart." Maya looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for something real. And in that moment, James knew he had to make her believe it. He had to make her see that despite the hurt, despite the cruelty of the past, there was still a future for them. A future where she didn't have to hide anymore. James stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind racing as he processed what Maya had just said. He felt the weight of her words, like a heavy stone dropped into the pit of his stomach, rippling outward with shock and disbelief. Pregnant? It was almost impossible for him to grasp. His mind replayed her confession, but the reality of what she had said was hard to accept. He stared at her, his eyes wide. Pregnant? The word barely left his lips, and even then it felt foreign, like a strange echo bouncing off the walls of his mind. "Maya, what do you mean?" He was desperate for clarity, for some kind of explanation, but his heart was already heavy with the weight of what she was revealing. Maya's face grew pale, and she stepped back slightly, as if bracing herself for the blow she knew was coming. She refused to meet his gaze, instead looking down at her hands, wringing them nervously. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to drag you into it. I didn't want to cause you more pain." She took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "But you need to know the truth." James could feel the ground shifting beneath him. His legs felt weak, and for the first time he felt completely lost. His mind raced through the years, trying to piece together fragments of his past, the missed moments, the things he never knew. How had he not known? How had he missed all of this? "You were carrying my child." His voice was hoarse, as if the words themselves were a struggle to say. The idea was so overwhelming that it was hard for him to process. All this time, he had believed his life had followed a straight path, one defined by ambition, success, and power. But this was a storm that threatened to change everything. Maya nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears, though she blinked them away before they could fall. "I found out not long after the accident. I didn't know what to do. I was scared, James. I didn't know how to handle it. My life, my whole world, it felt like it was crumbling around me. I knew your father wouldn't accept it. I knew that if I kept the baby, I would be seen as nothing more than a mistake. I didn't want to be that for you." James's heart ached as he watched her, her words cutting through him like a knife. She had been carrying his child, and he hadn't even known. He had been so caught up in his own world, so consumed with his business and the idea of power and control, that he hadn't even realized that something as precious as his child had been slipping through his fingers. "I didn't want to take away your chance at a perfect life," Maya continued, her voice trembling with vulnerability. I couldn't bring a child into that world. Your father's world. I knew he would never accept me, and I couldn't put you in the position of having to choose between your family and me. So, I made the decision. I left. I disappeared." James stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the woman who had saved his life. This was the woman he had thought of so many times over the years. And now, standing before him, he was learning that she had carried his child, his son, and had made the most painful decision of her life to protect him. "You left?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me? I would have helped you, Maya. I would have. I didn't want to burden you." Maya cut him off, her voice raw with emotion. "I didn't want you to feel trapped. I knew you had your whole life ahead of you, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin that. I was already in so much pain, and I couldn't bear the thought of bringing you into it." She wiped at her eyes, her hands trembling. "I left because I thought it was what was best for you." James was reeling, his mind overwhelmed by the revelation. He took another step toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. A child, his child. The gravity of the situation was starting to sink in, but there was still so much he didn't understand. "Where is he, Maya? Where is our son?" Maya's face crumpled, and the tears she had been holding back finally spilled over. She turned away from him, taking a deep breath as she fought to keep herself from breaking. "His name is Caleb," she said softly, her voice breaking with emotion. "I raised him alone. He's 20 now, James. He's a good kid." She wiped her eyes, struggling to compose herself. "I did the best I could. I wanted to protect him from the kind of world that doesn't accept us, from the kind of world that doesn't understand who we are. I wanted him to have a chance at something better." James was speechless, his heart aching for the child he had never known. Caleb, his son, the boy he had never seen, never met, but who now existed as the living, breathing connection to a past he had never fully understood. "Why didn't you ever tell me about him, Maya?" His voice was desperate, pleading for some kind of answer, some kind of understanding. "I would have been there for you. I would have helped. I would have been a father." Maya turned to face him, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She gave him a sad, broken smile, the weight of her choices visible in her eyes. I couldn't let you have a part of me when I knew your world would never accept us. I couldn't let you have a son that your father would look down on, that your world would never accept. So I did what I thought was best." James stood there overwhelmed, the pieces of his past and present colliding in a whirlwind of emotions. He had a son who had grown up without him, without the love and care he could have provided. And Maya, the woman he had never truly known, had carried the burden of that decision alone. "I don't care about my father's world, Maya," James said, his voice shaking with intensity. "I care about Caleb, I care about you, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The realization hit James like a thunderbolt, sending shockwaves through his entire body. He had a son he had never known existed, a child he had been kept apart from for 20 years. All of those years, those countless moments of emptiness and longing, now felt so futile in the face of the truth. Caleb, his son, was out there, living a life that James had never been a part of. For the first time, the weight of everything, his power, his success, his wealth, felt irrelevant. All he could think about now was Caleb, and how he had missed out on the one thing that truly mattered in life. Maya wiped a tear from her cheek, her fingers trembling. "I wanted to tell you," she said, her voice filled with regret. "But after hearing your father that day, I was scared. I didn't want my child to grow up feeling unwanted or unloved because of the color of his skin. I didn't want him to grow up with that kind of burden." James swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it hard to breathe. Every word Maya spoke hit him like a ton of bricks, each word sinking deeper into his soul. Unwanted. How could anyone ever think of Caleb as unwanted? How could anyone ever believe that a child, his child, could be cast aside like that? "Where is he?" James finally asked, the urgency in his voice reflecting the desperation in his heart, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. "Where's Caleb now?" Maya smiled softly, a touch of pride in her eyes. "He's in college now. He's a brilliant young man, James. He's studying to be a lawyer, and I know he's going to do amazing things. He's just like you in so many ways, and in others, he's his own person. He's grown up to be kind, compassionate, and smart." The words filled James with a strange mix of pride and sadness. He had missed so much of his son's life, and yet, in that moment, he knew that nothing could ever be as important as being there for him now. He could still make things right, still build a relationship with Caleb, but the years of lost time would always linger, like an unspoken ache. As if on cue, the door to the cafe opened, and a tall young man walked in. His features were a striking blend of both Maya and James. He had James's sharp jawline, a defining characteristic that James had always been proud of, and Maya's warm, inviting eyes that seemed to radiate kindness and understanding. The young man paused when he saw them. "Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "Who is this?" Maya hesitated, her heart racing. It was one thing to tell Caleb about his father, but standing here, face to face with James, was a different reality altogether. But before she could say anything, James stepped forward, his heart in his throat, and held out his hand to the young man. "I'm your father," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. For a long moment, Caleb stood there, looking between the two of them, uncertainty clouding his features. He took a cautious step forward, but there was something in his eyes, something that told James that, despite the shock, Caleb was willing to listen. Slowly, almost as if testing the waters, Caleb extended his hand. "You're really my father?" he asked, his voice soft, like he was unsure of how to process the overwhelming truth. James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes, Caleb. I'm so sorry for everything I missed, for not being there for you. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm your father, and I want to make up for the time we lost." The air between them was thick with emotions, pain, confusion, hope, and even a sense of cautious optimism. Caleb stared at James for a moment longer, searching his face for signs of sincerity, for signs that this was real. Then, slowly, he gave a small nod. "Okay," he said simply, his voice quiet but steady. James felt a rush of relief flood through him, the weight of the past 25 years beginning to lift, even if just a little. He had a long way to go to make things right, but this was a step, the first step. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. James spent every moment he could with Caleb, getting to know the son he had never been able to raise. They talked about everything, from Caleb's studies to his dreams, from the things that kept him up at night to the joys he had in life. James was determined to make up for the lost years, even if it was one small conversation at a time. But it wasn't just about getting to know Caleb. It was about healing the past, healing the wounds that had been inflicted on Maya, on their relationship, and on their son. There was one more thing left for James to do, to confront the man who had caused so much damage, the man whose bigoted views had shaped so much of James's life, his father, the man who had tried to keep them apart for years, who had dictated the course of James's life with his cruel, narrow-minded beliefs. One afternoon, James found himself standing in front of his father's grave, a place he hadn't visited in years. The stone marker loomed in front of him, and he couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had led him to this moment. The years of distance, the years of trying to prove his worth to a man who had never really understood him. James took a deep breath and knelt before the grave, his hand resting on the cold stone. "You were wrong," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You thought love was about status, about color, but love isn't about that. It's about kindness, sacrifice, and fate. You tried to keep us apart, tried to make me believe that love had boundaries, but love found a way. It always does." He stood up and turned, looking at Maya and Caleb, who stood a few feet away, watching him with soft, understanding expressions. He could see the love in their eyes, the love that had always been there, even when it seemed impossible. He felt in that moment a sense of peace he had never known before. "I lost 25 years, James said, his voice steady, "but I won't lose any more. I'm here now. I want to be the father and the man you both deserve." Maya smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with hope. Caleb, too, nodded, his eyes filled with acceptance and understanding. They were a family that had been torn apart by prejudice, but was now reunited by love, by the willingness to heal and move forward. The past was still there, lingering like a shadow, but James knew that with Maya and Caleb by his side, he could face it. Together, they would build the future they deserved, one filled with love, respect, and the knowledge that no matter what, they were stronger than the hatred of the past. The world outside was bustling with life, but inside the small cafe, a sense of peace and fulfillment filled the air. James stood by the counter, watching Maya move gracefully through the room. She had worked so hard for this moment, and now, as she stood in her own cafe, her dream was finally alive. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, everything felt right. James had offered her a life of luxury, the best apartments, the finest clothes, everything that money could buy. But Maya had always been different. She had never wanted to live a life of dependency, even though she knew how easy it would have been to accept James's help. She had raised Caleb alone, worked tirelessly to make ends meet, and built a life for herself and her son, all on her own terms. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, James," Maya said one evening as she stood beside him. "But I can't just accept handouts. I have to build this myself. This cafe, this life, it has to be on my terms." James had understood her completely. He admired her strength, her determination, and her commitment to never settling for less than what she deserved. It was part of what made her who she was. It was why he loved her. "You don't have to do it alone," James replied gently, his voice filled with understanding. "But I get it. I respect that, and I'll be here to support you, every step of the way." And support her he did. Together they worked tirelessly to turn her dream into reality. James helped her with the business side of things, marketing, planning, and funding, but he never took the reins. This was Maya's project, her passion, and she was determined to make it flourish. She threw herself into every detail, from the decor of each new cafe to the recipes she created for her customers. With each passing month, the cafe chain grew, slowly at first, but then rapidly, as people fell in love with the warmth of Maya's hospitality and the charm of her food. Maya's name became synonymous with success, and her cafes became the heart of the community. Her strength and determination were no longer a quiet secret. The world saw her for the incredible woman she was. But it wasn't just the cafe chain that blossomed. As James stood by her side, he watched her grow in ways that filled his heart with pride. She had never been a woman to let circumstances define her, and now she was building an empire of her own. And through it all, love blossomed between them in ways that went beyond the business, beyond the family. They were partners, not just in work, but in life. And then there was Caleb. James's heart swelled with pride as he watched his son walk across the stage to receive his diploma. Caleb had worked hard to get to this point, years of study, of determination, of dreams, and now he was about to graduate with honors, his future wide open, ready for whatever he chose. James could hardly contain his excitement as he cheered from the crowd, clapping louder than anyone else. James had missed so much of Caleb's life, but he wasn't about to miss another moment. He had spent so many years trying to make up for lost time, but seeing Caleb graduate was a moment of redemption. James had been a father to Caleb in every sense now, not just in name, but in his presence, in his love, in the support he gave. Caleb smiled as he caught sight of his father in the crowd, the connection between them undeniable. Caleb knew that no matter what, James was there for him. They were a family, bound by love and by the unspoken understanding that no matter how hard life had been, they had found their way back to each other. After the ceremony, James and Maya stood together with Caleb, the three of them smiling and laughing, as if the past 25 years had never happened. It was as if the universe had given them a second chance, and they were going to make the most of it. There was no more regret, no more pain. The love that had once been denied to them had now taken root, and it was stronger than ever. Later that evening, they sat around a dinner table together, the three of them enjoying a quiet meal. Caleb had decided to go to law school, and James had offered to help in any way he could, but Caleb had insisted on earning his way, just like Maya had done. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. "I'm so proud of you, Caleb," Maya said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've worked so hard, and I know you're going to do great things." Caleb smiled, his eyes shining. "Thanks, Mom, and thank you, Dad." He paused, looking at both of them, his heart full. "I couldn't have asked for a better family." James's chest tightened with emotion, his eyes misting over. He had spent so many years wishing for this moment, longing for the bond he'd never known with his son. But now here they were, together, stronger than ever. "I'm proud of you too, Caleb," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "You've grown into an incredible young man, and I can't wait to see what the future holds for you. Whatever you need, I'll be here." Maya reached across the table and took James's hand, a soft smile playing on her lips. In that moment, there was nothing else in the world but the love they shared. They had all fought hard to be together, and now nothing could tear them apart. The world had once tried to keep them apart, the prejudices, the lies, the judgments, but love had always found a way. And now, with the past healed, with their family whole again, they were stronger than ever. They had built something beautiful together, and nothing could undo that. Love had won. The years that had once seemed like a painful separation now felt like nothing more than distant echoes. The future was bright for them all, Caleb with his bright future ahead, Maya continuing to build her cafe empire, and James, finally, at peace, knowing that he had found his way back to the family he had always wanted. In the end, love had healed the wounds of the past, and fate had brought them all back together. The future was theirs to shape, and they would do it, side by side, never looking back.